Several thousands of asylum seekers from Haiti, South America, and Central America set off from Tapachula, Mexico, to the United States border. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has told his foreign minister to expel the ambassadors from 10 countries, including France, Germany, and the United States, who had appealed for the release of a jailed civil society leader. And delegates from the United Nations Security Council delegation met with Mali's transitional president, Colonel Assimi Goïta. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada, and these are the news. Several thousand of asylum seekers from Haiti, South America, and Central America set off from Tapachula, Mexico, to the United States border. The latest mass movement of people trying to pass north through Mexico said they hope to eventually reach the U.S. border, where the number of asylum seekers trying to gain entry was already hitting new records. Some 3,000 people, including families with young children, began their long journey on foot on Saturday from the city of Tapachula near the Guatemala border towards Mexico's capital. One of the caravan's organizers said he was leading the group to Mexico City in protest of the lack of government assistance in the south, where officials have attempted to contain thousands of people and to demand legal documents that will let them move freely in the country. And the bodies of 7 prisoners were found within the Penitenciaria del Litoral, Ecuador's most violent prison, located in the southern city of Guayaquil. Ecuador's prison authorities said the bodies were found in a pavilion used for conjugal visits, and police have stepped in to investigate. The prison was gripped by riots last month that saw more than 100 inmates killed and over 80 injured in gun-related violence. The penitentiary agency also reported that last week 4 detainees were found dead in the same prison, classifying it as a possible suicide. President Guillermo Lasso declared a state of emergency for the country's penitentiaries last month to free up resources and increase control inside prisons. Officials said gangs have alliances with transnational criminal groups and are battling over drug trafficking routes. In Peru, President Pedro Castillo announced the extension of gas services to other regions of the South American nation as part of his policy of widespread use of this resource. The Peruvian President, Pedro Castillo, announced that the development of the infrastructure for the mass distribution of natural gas in the regions of Cusco, Puno, Apurimac, Arequipa, Moquegua, Tacna, Ayacucho, and Ucayali will begin. The purpose of this measure is that this resource reaches more families and promotes the development of productive activities. Since last month, the executive has summoned the consortium of companies that exploit the Camisea gas project, one of the largest in Latin America, to review the contracts to increase taxes and royalties in favor of the state. Colombia's most wanted drug trafficker and the leader of the country's largest criminal gang has been captured. Dairo Antonio Suga, alias Otoniel, who headed the country's largest narco-trafficking gang known as the Gulf Clan, was captured near one of his main outposts in Necoclí, near the border with Panama. According to police, Otoniel was hiding in the jungle in the Urabo region, where he is from, and he did not use a telephone, relying on couriers to communicate. Around 500 soldiers, backed by 22 helicopters, were deployed in the Necoclí municipality to carry out the operation, which left 1 police officer dead. Now we address other topics. South Africa has begun inoculating its teenagers as part of the country's COVID-19 vaccination program. Picking up the speed of vaccination with more COVID-19 vaccines becoming available, South Africa's health department added young people aged between 12 to 17 years old into the population who are eligible for inoculation, adding 6 million people to the program. Some youth are clearly encouraged that their time to receive the jab has finally arrived. While more than 20 million South Africans have already been vaccinated, the government hopes the new cohort will push that figure even higher and closer to some sort of population immunity. To further mitigate the safety of vaccinations in children, the government plans to only administer a single dose until further research and data is collected, which can inform future decisions.
Mass vaccination is to reduce everybody's high risk across the board. And so, I think by vaccinating these individuals, we are still taking into consideration a risk and a benefit ratio. And luckily that myocarditis is rare. When it does occur, it seems to be mild and self-limiting. The idea, I think,
Now we move on to other topics. Hurricane Rake edged slowly closer to Mexico's Pacific coast on Sunday, and it is expected to unleash heavy rains north of the beach resort of Acapulco late in the evening. The United States National Hurricane Center said that Rake was packing maximum sustained winds near 140 kilometers per hour with strong gusts as it moved northward at about 6 kilometers per hour. The storm was located 210 kilometers south of the beach city of Situanejo in Guerrero State. The hurricane is estimated to strengthen as it draws closer to the coast, with life-threatening storm surge and dangerous hurricane-force winds along a stretch of coastline from Tecpan de Galeana in Guerrero to Punta San Telmo in Michoacán. The storm is expected to dissipate by Tuesday. The Spanish island of La Palma experienced a 4.8 magnitude earthquake with a depth of 38 kilometers. The same day, the Cumbre Vieja volcano again collapsed into the main cone, causing large lava flows. According to the National Geographic Institute of Spain, the earthquake was the greater magnitude since the volcano eruption for over a month. The Cumbre Vieja volcano, one of the most active volcanic complexes in the Canary Islands, erupted on September 19th. The largest earthquakes recorded since the onset of the eruption had been 4.5 on the Richter scale and had occurred on October 17th. Until now, the volcano destroyed nearly 900 acres and destroyed about 2,000 buildings, many of them are homes. In addition, about 7,000 people have had to be evacuated since the start of the emergency. More than 600,000 people have been affected by widespread flooding in South Sudan since May, with many forced to flee their homes. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, South Sudan has experienced the worst flooding in 60 years, with over 700,000 people impacted across the country. After weeks of heavy rains, the floods have swept away homes and inundated farmland, forcing families and livestock to flee to higher ground and neighboring towns. Others are stranded on islands surrounded by water, unable to cross to safety. Many of those affected were still struggling to recover from 2 previous years of flooding. With rains expected to continue for the remainder of the year, the UN Refugee Agency warns that an increasing number of people will need humanitarian assistance, particularly following the loss of crops and livestock. We have more coming up after a short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has told his foreign minister to expel the ambassadors of 10 countries, including France, Germany, and the United States, who had appealed for the release of a jailed civil society leader. 7 of the ambassadors represent Turkey's North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies, and the expulsions will open the deepest rift with the West in Turkey head of state's 19 years in office. The envoys issued a highly unusual joint statement last Monday, saying that the continued detention of Parisian-born philanthropist and activist Osman Kavala was not good for the country. The ambassadors of Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Finland, New Zealand, and the United States called for a just and speedy resolution to Kavala's case and for his urgent release. Osman Kavala has been in prison since late 2017, charged with financing nationwide protests in 2013 and with involvement in the 2016 failed coup. The Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, assured that the European Union is attacking Hungarians and Polish by treating them as enemies. The ultra-right-wing leader expressed his support for the Polish during a speech on the occasion of the anniversary of the 1956 anti-Soviet revolution, ratifying that the high European leaders lead the decisions on the communitarian countries without their full knowledge. Statements he made in preparation for a campaign for the upcoming elections, the first ones to be held in more than a decade and which could represent a possible risk to Mr. Orban's mandate.
Let's not forget the fact that when we got down household utility bills, when we slashed the surplus profit of multinational companies, and when we sent home the IMF, the entire European Union attacked us. Brussels is talking to and behaving with us and the Poles as if we were enemies.
Now we continue. An emergency zone was declared around a blazing cargo ship off of Western Canada after containers carrying more than 50 tons of dangerous chemical caught on fire. In a statement, the Canadian Coast Guard says 16 crew members were evacuated from the Zim Kingston ship of Victoria, British Columbia's capital. The fire was caused by a combustible chemical powder spilling from containers that were damaged in a storm as the ship, arriving from South Korea, approached the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. At the time, about 40 of the ship's containers tumbled into the Pacific Ocean in rough seas. According to a navigation warning sent to all ships in the area, a 1-mile exclusion zone was in effect around the container ship in the vicinity of Constance Bank due to danger of falling containers. And vote counting started in Uzbekistan after Sunday's presidential election. Voters in Uzbekistan went to the polls in a presidential election in which incumbent President Savart Mirziyoyev faces no solid opposition and is almost certain to win a second term. Voting across the Central Asian country of 34 million people began at 8 a.m. local time and went over 8 p.m. In his bid to secure a second 5-year term, Mirziyoyev faces 4 contenders who were loyal to his government and who were plucked from parties in the rubber stamp parliament.
The main problems are in the regions, not the capital. In the capital, everything is more or less fine. People have water, gas, electricity. In the regions, unfortunately, there is a lack of all this.
Delegates from the United Nations Security Council delegation met with Mali's transitional president, Colonel Assimi Goïta. Security Council delegates led by the UN ambassadors from the US, France, and Niger arrived on Saturday for 2 days of talks to push the military-led interim government for a return to democracy after 2 coups in 9 months. They also met with civil society representatives and armed groups that signed a 2015 peace agreement. Human Rights Watch called on the UN to pressure Mali in weekend talks to investigate summary executions and disappearances allegedly carried out by the military in the African country. The delegation also said to international pressure on coup leaders to abide by a February 27, 2022 deadline set by the Economic Community of West African States for a presidential election. Ugandan police said on Sunday that a deadly explosion that killed 1 person and injured 3 others at a roadside artery in the capital Kampala was an act of domestic terror. Police spokesperson Fred Inanga said the attackers arrived at the popular grilled pork joint in northern Kampala at around 8:30 p.m. on Saturday, carrying a plastic shopping bag that they placed under a table. Shortly after leaving, 30 minutes later, an explosion ripped through the eatery. President Yoweri Museveni earlier said the blast seems to be a terrorist act and vowed to hunt down those responsible.
That the explosion at Komamboga Ward has been confirmed to be an intentional act of domestic terrorism. These 4 victims were within the radius of 5 square meters. Right now, our condolences go to the family of one of the deceased, identified as Emily Nyinaneza, a 20-year-old waitress.
In Senegal, dozens of women took to the streets of the car capital on Saturday to protest against climate change. The demonstrators explained that the main objective of the mobilization is to promote their participation in the climate debate, to encourage and educate people about the importance of climate concerns and its effects. These proposals are to be reflected at the COP26 Climate Summit to be held next month in Glasgow. The mobilization was also carried out and dedicated to future generations so that they take into account some initiatives to counteract climate change.
We know that there will soon be this great summit in Glasgow, and we want to hear the claims of women who are committed and who fight against climate injustice. We know that we are all committed. We all have the same planet. Why don't the others stop polluting our continent? We do not want this pollution anymore. We have no more water tables. In the interior of the country, animals are dying for lack of water or the soil is poisoned. We can't do agriculture anymore. How are we going to develop?
In Afghanistan, at least 8 children died due to famine and poverty in the west of Kabul, where the Hazara community lives. The former deputy Mohammad Mohaqiq took to social media to denounce that the Taliban movement does not provide an adequate standard for living for the Afghan population, which aggravates the situation of famine and poverty in different areas of the country. For this reason, the former parliamentarians urged the international community to provide support to members of the Hazara community and other minorities with the aim of reducing the mortality rate of children given the serious malnutrition. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back. Now we present a brief summary of this week's main stories.
Latin American countries saw several demonstrations against economic inequality, the pandemic mismanagement, and social instability in the region.
In Chile, people took to the streets to mark 2 years of the social outburst of late 2019. Protesters called for justice for the victims of state repression, the release of political prisoners, and the resignation of President Piñera over his role in the repression, and the recent revelations contained in the Pandora Papers investigation.
Also, a nationwide general strike entered the street of Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, with organizers denouncing the rapidly worsening security situation. The Haitian protests gained control over Port-au-Prince and irregular kidnappings. This week, 17 Christian missionaries were kidnapped for ransom, the second such incident in the Caribbean nation.
This week, Ecuador saw protests of agricultural workers against high fuel prices imposed by the government and other economic measures that affect the sector. Given the situation, Ecuador President Guillermo Lasso announced a 60-day state of emergency, which allowed the army to patrol the streets throughout the country. Ecuador's people also reject his involvement in the Pandora Papers scandal.
In Guatemala, tensions mounted as former military members stormed the Congress facilities to demand the government to comply with the promised sole compensation of about $15,000 for their participation in the armed conflict from 1960 to 1996. Anti-riot police used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the demonstrators.
In Bolivia, social movements and human rights defenders carried a 200-kilometer march from the town of Caracollo to La Paz to demand the legal proceedings advance for the conviction of former de facto presidents Yanin Áñez and the other figures responsible for the acts of violence perpetrated in 2019 in the context of the coup against the government of Evo Morales.
Union and civil society groups protested in Panama City against a questioned reform of the electoral code, as the country's president Laurentino Cortizo has only vetoed an article of the legislative project. Over 4,000 people participated in the mobilizations, demanding the inclusion of articles in favor of gender parity, allocation of seats, financing of political parties, nor the criminal electoral jurisdiction.
Other topics were prominent in our news brief this week. Venezuela's government announced the kidnapping of diplomatic Alex Saab by the U.S. government with the complicity of Cape Verde authorities. Given the situation, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro qualified Saab's kidnapping as inhuman and unfair.
The Venezuelan people rejected Alex Saab's kidnapping and demonstrated to support his cause. Saab's wife, Camila Fabri Saab, offered an exclusive interview for TeleSUR, explaining the emotional toll of this incident for the Saab Fabri family and how Cape Verdean authorities violated due process in her husband's detention.
These other events were trending in our informative agenda. Barbados Parliament laid down one of the final steps to the Caribbean nation becoming a republic on electing its first president, putting an end to the colonial vestige of the British head of state. In a special joint session of Parliament, the House of Assembly, as a collective, voted on the election of Governor-General Dame Sandra Mason, who will become the island's first president on November 30th, Independence Day, and the date of which Barbados becomes a republic.
We move on to other topics. Colombia and Venezuela saw steps up and setbacks in their bilateral relations. The President of the National Assembly of Venezuela, Jorge Rodriguez, announced on Wednesday that he received a proposal approved by the Senate of Colombia for the normalization of diplomatic and trade relations between the two countries.
Soon after this announcement, Colombian President Iván Duque denied all possibility of resuming diplomatic relations with the Venezuelan government during a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, rejecting all efforts made by the Colombian Senate on this matter.
These were the main pieces of information that trend on our agenda this week. For more updates, analysis, and details, stay tuned to TeleSUR English on YouTube or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media for all the latest news. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.